Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. Though, frankly, I don't think I have ever done an event in such an expensive room in my entire life. There are portraits of some extraordinary people in here, some of whom you recognize, some of whom you will not recognize. I was just saying to Naya before, and perhaps it's a way to start thinking about our topic tonight, that the portrait behind me, Omai, painted by Joshua Reynolds, was saved for the National Portrait Gallery by a series of luminaries. And I was struck, looking at the list over there, interestingly, not a single one of the 30 or so people who came up with how many millions? Several millions to save this for the nation would have shared Omai's heritage. Not a single one. I'd like you to reflect on that as we start tonight. Do we have to be the thing to value the thing? I hope that when we, in our discussion tonight, we don't perhaps base too much on abstractions. Discussions about culture wars, identity politics, and so on, quite often devolve into a political and academic arguments, rather divorced from the way that people actually live and the actual choices that people make. It is true that some identity questions do present themselves as arguments about individual identity choices, and trans is the standout example at the moment. The extent to which a society needs to respond to an individual's decision about their personal identity. And I don't for one moment want to make this a small point. It is a large point. Some of you know that in my day job, I run a people business, and we spend a lot of time with our hundreds of clients thinking about and worrying about the culture of their organizations. And every workplace, pretty much, in this country, on the continent, and in the United States, is wrestling with speech and dress codes, which tend to be proxies for degrees of recognition of different kinds of identity. And the requirement for conformity with orthodoxy isn't just something that is strong or written about in newspapers. It is a real thing, the stuff of workplace codes of conduct and training. I myself, 6 weeks ago, had to complete a piece of workplace compliance to allow me to continue to, I won't say exactly what I do, otherwise you'll know that it's Sky TV, and I had to complete a piece of code of conduct in the workplace, which required me to agree to a view about gender, which, number one, I didn't agree with, and number two, I think, and I don't think, I know because I wrote the law, is unlawful. But I couldn't go, those of you who do these things, you know that you get to a place, and unless you give the right answer, you can't go further. And if you don't go further, you can't complete the training. And if you can't complete the training, you can't come to work on Monday. This is an organization, this particular one, employs 27,000 people who all had to agree to something unlawful. I suspect this is true right around the country and in workplaces. So when we start to think about these things, we tend to talk about them as though they are abstract arguments between clever people who write for magazines. Actually, in truth, the reason that much of what we're talking about tonight is so potent is because it is the real stuff that people have to deal with day by day. And by the way, just so that we're clear, because I just realized there are journalists in the room, I completed the training, but then wrote to the chairman of my company to explain that I would never, ever do the thing that the training told me to do, and nor would anybody on my team. Now, the landscape crosses all of the protected characteristics. But the main business of our conversation tonight is on race, and that is partly because race is, in this context, unique. This is a characteristic that is, in many ways, different to all others, certainly, well, for reasons I'll go on to give in a second. No one chooses their race. No one actually can demand that other people see them in a way that doesn't relate to their demographic grouping. You know, I hear on the radio and I see on telly lots of people who do a lot of smart aleck arguments about DNA, we're all basically the same under the skin, and so on. But the truth is that racial difference is both a social and biological reality. And unlike most other characteristics, it is inherently immutable. It is immutable. You can't become the other thing. By the way, so we're clear, and of course, we're all friends here, so I think we ought to be direct with each other. Some people will say that sexual orientation is immutable, and that may be true, but it can be disguised. I can't look different to the way that I look. No amount of makeup, and I can tell you this from experience, no amount of makeup can make me look like David Dimbleby. It is one of the few human characteristics that defines us, both for ourselves and for other people from birth to death. And it carries powerful cultural baggage. And one of the things that we find in our business, dealing particularly with corporate leadership, is that it is the scariest. It is the scariest because the experience of people who are not like us lies behind an opaque curtain. We don't really understand what it's like to be the other thing. We may be close to people who are disabled or who have a different sexual orientation. Pretty much all of us know somebody of the opposite sex. You know, even I have a mother. We are intimate with people across that line. Typically, we are not across this particular line. That brings me to the point of why I think this matters so much today. Demographics aren't destiny, but they do put a pretty strong cage around the future. In this country, virtually all population growth to the end of the century will arise from migration. Today, a sixth of our population is foreign-born. A third of all births every year in this country, and this has been true for 15 years, are accounted for by foreign-born mothers. I've done some back-of-the-envelope calculations today, and what they tell me is that by the middle of this century, half of Britain's population, which should be about 80 million people, will be foreign-born, the children of foreign-born parents or the grandchildren of foreign-born grandparents. You don't have to make hysterical great replacement predictions to acknowledge that this leads to a very different Britain. When I started work, the assumption was that there'd be an organic process of assimilation in which minority groups would be relatively small and they'd become pretty much like everybody else. Actually, the truth of the matter is pressure towards cultural fragmentation has actually gone the opposite way. Right now, there are 29 communities of more than 100,000 individuals in this country who can claim minority ethnic status. Now, does that matter? Well, it doesn't matter. 100,000 is a small town. And in the modern world, that is a self-sufficient community that can create its own businesses, create its own media, its own social networks. And one of the important things about these groups today is that unlike when my parents came here in 1950, they don't leave the old country behind. A good indicator is remittances. In 2004, remittances by people from who had emigrated, and we're talking not company remittances, we're talking about family payments that you send back to your cousin or your mother or whatever, were about $5 billion a year. That's 2004. Today, they are topping $12 billion. The top countries for remittances are, not surprisingly, India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Poland, Kenya, and the Philippines. People come and go on cheap flights. They own property where their families come from, and they set up businesses within the communities. Some bring spouses from other countries. At the same time, the pressures to conform are weaker. When we came here, there were big workforces. My father was a railway man, then he was a postman. He joined workforces that were in the hundreds of thousands. That's quite rare now. But these were engines of integration, binding institutions, trade unions, voluntary associations like the Scouts and Guides, churches. They're all smaller, less pervasive now. So all of the objective pressures that used to lead to integration have weakened. And objectively, if you map ethnic groups, which is one of the things that our companies do, you will see that they cluster with others closer to places of work and so on. Does it matter? Well, it does. Because what we're seeing is that the fact of difference bears on behaviors. And I'm not making a point about what is good or bad behavior, just objectively. We see at one end, parents from some communities making demands of schools about what may be taught, how it's taught, because of their particular cultural sensitivities. At the other end, we see subtler pressures. For example, the desire to vary planning rules so that religious institutions can be put in particular places, megachurches, temples, and so on. There's also the dark side, seen at times today. You will see ethnically defined crime, and I mean knife crime, people trafficking, child abuse, are a feature of our society in a way that I don't think we understood before. Challenge is also extending to public services. Very simple example I want to put on the table because it came to me yesterday and I was asked for advice about this. By law, family of, for example, an autistic child may ask for a carer who speaks in a particular way. The same right will almost certainly attach itself to dementia parents. It will permit a request for a carer with, for example, I'm quoting here, clear, unaccented English. Now, we allow that by law, and in fact, in some senses, we encourage it. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know, I'm not even sure if I've got an opinion. But the point I really want to make is this different society is confronting us with dilemmas and trade-offs that we need to articulate and we need to choose. I think we are extremely poor at that at the moment because by and large, when we discuss these things, we discuss them in a heated, rather finger-pointing way and perhaps overly political way. But I think tonight, I expect, because of the quality of our audience and particularly the quality of our panel, to do better than that, because we need to. Our panel tonight, John Gray, philosopher and author, Matthew Syed, journalist, also author, Emma Dabiri, Guardian columnist and author. Is everybody an author? And Ayishat Akanbi, fashion stylist and should-be author. I'm going to kick off and ask each of our panelists to say a few words in response to a single question. The new Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, when she took up the post, said, pretty much the first thing she said that was noticed, that culture wars are over. Is she right? John Gray.
No, she isn't right. Sorry, no, she isn't right. But it's more interesting to ask why she isn't right and what culture wars are. I think culture wars are like populism. It doesn't come from, people talk about it as an evil or something we should get rid of, but what we call populism doesn't come from nowhere. Populism and culture wars are a reaction to something else. Populism is what liberals call the political blowback against their own policies. Or to put it in a slightly different way, the blowback against the social disruption produced by their own policies. And it's very rare that liberals own this blowback. It's very rare that they admit that what they've done in terms of globalization, opening up markets to the whole world, mass migration, and in other respects, has actually produced the phenomenon they call populism. And in terms of culture war, I think culture war is actually what liberals call resistance to the changes in language, in how people work together and how they play sports together, in terms of what subjects are within the bounds of polite discussability and what aren't. That's what liberals call culture wars. So to me, when someone says culture wars are over, it means we're going to shut people up. Basically, culture wars are a resistance to a particular worldview, a particular project which is being imposed on people that they do not share, or if they do share parts of it, they've never been asked about. So I think she's wrong.
Emma Dabiri.
I agree and disagree. I agree that I don't think the culture wars are going anywhere soon, because we labor under the delusion that there's some sort of modern phenomenon. But really the culture wars, and especially when it comes to race, which I want to come back to defining in a moment, because I think if we're going to use these terms, we have to define our terms. But I think the culture wars are just the most contemporary iteration of the type of division that the ruling classes have been able to use to mobilize people against acting in their own best interests, creating forms of division that go back to the invention of race, because race is actually not there are genetic differences in people, but they can't be understood.
The invention of race.
Exactly, and they can't be understood through. You can't impose race onto those genetic differences. It's actually about geographical location rather than the social construction of race. But when race was first invented, it's an English innovation, but it's the English in the colonial Caribbean. But when the concept of a black and white race, as we understand those two racial groups today, is first introduced, it's in Barbados through a series of laws called the Negro Codes in 1661. And one of the there's multiple reasons why these laws and these concepts are introduced at this particular point in history. But one of them, and the one that I want to focus on for a moment, is that in Barbados at that time, there had been a number of uprisings of indentured Irish and kidnapped Africans who were not yet enslaved. They were more like, at this moment, they hadn't necessarily become chattel slaves. That legal distinction comes kind of after these codes. But at this point, the indentured Irish and the kidnapped Africans were often coming together and attacking the English and Scottish landlords. This was extremely threatening to the status quo and to the power system to the ruling class in Barbados, because there were more of these oppressed people. One of the things that the introduction of the kind of idea of a white race and a black race did extremely effectively was to prevent those forms of coalition being able to emerge between those indentured Irish who would start to view themselves as part of a white race, a concept that hadn't existed before, and start to view the Africans as part of a black race with with different legal connotations if you were white or if you were black. So race was actually one of the reasons that race was invented, and as I said, there's a few, but I don't want to go into this too much now. But one of the reasons that race was invented in the idea of a black and a white race in that particular moment, at that particular place in the world, was to prevent those kind of forms of coalition and solidarity from being able to emerge and pitting these groups against each other. To me, the culture wars is really the continuation of that kind of system of division, and it is something that is stoked and fueled by the ruling classes to prevent people from often being able to see the commonalities that they share. So yeah.
Thank you, Emma. I'm very glad you brought Barbados into the conversation, having been there and discovered the plantation, which is called Rock Hall, where my great-great-grandmother came from earlier this year. Ayishat.
No, I agree with both. I don't believe the culture wars is over, and largely I don't see the culture wars going anywhere anytime soon, because a lot of it comes from our newfound ways of connecting with each other and our interconnectivity. I don't think it's something a politician can necessarily defeat very easily, because it comes from our resentments, people being able to share their resentments with each other. I don't think anyone could have potentially predicted that some of the things that we're arguing about today, namely gender being, I think, an easy example, would have manifested in the way that it's manifested today. And I think going forward, people can use the culture war framing, whether that's seeing the world through oppressor versus oppressed in everything that they do, or in every kind of hot topic or important topic that comes up. And so we do see that with, even new conversations that have been, or at least issues that have come to light recently. I do think we see, people using a framework that very much comes from a culture war kind of mindset, and I think you can apply this mindset onto anything if you want. And so, so long as we have technology and the means to communicate in the ways that we do today, and so long as people feel as though, they can act in these spaces in any ways that they wish, and that they can mobilize people to share in their resentments, because I think shared hate or shared resentments are a lot more persuasive a lot of the times than shared interests. And so long as that is the lay of the land for now, I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon.
Matthew.
Well, thank you, Trevor. Thank you for inviting me tonight. Great to be here. When it comes to the culture wars and race, I would perhaps take a step back and look at the broader context. I hope it's not too controversial to say that I think this country has a very good story to tell when it comes to racial integration. My father was born in India, moved to Pakistan after partition, came to the UK to study law. Met my mother, who is white, red-headed, Welsh girl from a farming community. They fell in love. Both families back then, this is the 1960s, were strongly against the union. They said, don't do it. You're going to have mixed-race kids. Fortunately for me and my siblings, they rejected this advice. They got married and had a happy marriage. And I think over the course of their life, they saw a nation that became more tolerant of difference in terms of colour, race, and in almost every other respect. And if you look at the authoritative surveys that analyse tolerance, the Sewell report, some of you may be familiar with. It's difficult entirely to tell the political complexion of this audience. The Sewell report was widely castigated for describing a country that was pretty tolerant, but it seemed to me that the data was robust and well sourced. And I see this in my life. When I was at school, the P word was used liberally. My father struggled to get promoted in the civil service. Now I'm scarcely conscious of my colour. I haven't heard the P word for a very, very long time, and I go and watch Premier League football regularly. We've got a tremendously good story to tell, and I worry that when we talk about the culture wars, and let's look at the global context. Do you want to look at discrimination? Go to India and look at the caste system. Go to sub-Saharan Africa and look at inter-ethnic and inter-tribal violence. Go to Syria. Go to Lebanon. Look at the fantastic research by Michael Muthukrishna, Joe Henrik and others that look at cultural distance. We've got to get this story across. I can't stand identity politics, defining ourselves by our colour and our race. What did Martin Luther King say? Let's judge people on character, what they bring to a community. I think this has been divisive nonsense. perhaps one other point that I'd make. The most fundamental discrimination we see in the Western world today, in my view, and there was in the briefing notes the suggestion that we look forward 50 years, is the discrimination all of us are demonstrating towards future generations. And I'm not just talking about climate change, I'm talking about public debt. Over the last 50 years, France has run a fiscal deficit every single year bar none. Parties of left, right and centre. The UK every year bar 5, the US every year bar 4. You'll have seen public sector debt is now 100% of GDP here, 120% in the United States, 110% I think in France. We are spending money, borrowing from the future and putting ever more demands on those generations to come. That is the discrimination that we ignore with these ridiculous race-based culture wars. It's a distraction from that and a number of other, I think, fundamental issues that we face. So if you'll forgive me, Trevor, I think that the basis of this discussion is ducking many of the seismic issues we face. And I think these culture wars, and my final point, are like a Freudian displacement for left and right. I know when I write a column, if I tickle culture war nonsense, it will go viral and be amplified. You write on something serious, and there's pushback. It doesn't get amplified anything like as much because we don't like to talk about the truly important issues that we face, of which public debt is a very salient but not the only one. Thank you.